and welcome to AP Daily. My name is Greg Hill. Today we're going to talk about topic 3.5, historical causes of diffusion. This video will discuss how interactions between and among cultural traits and larger global forces, including colonialism and trade, can lead to new forms of cultural expression. In topic 3.6, Ms. Patel will continue our discussion on causes of diffusion by looking at contemporary forms of diffusion. So what will we learn? First, acculturation. When a group of people come into great contact, there's often a change of cultural traits. Think about your best friend, or one of your really cool friends, or maybe your girlfriend or boyfriend. If you hang around them enough, you start to pick up some of their habits, some of their mannerisms, some of the things that they say. That's an example of acculturation. Creolization. This is often identified with languages, but social scientists have expanded in other cultural traits. It's the process of the mixing of cultural traits into one new form. Lingua franca. This is basically a mutually understood language or a global language that members of a society all understand. Ways this occurs. Through colonialism and imperialism, you have some outside force, whether it be a colonizing power like Spain coming into Latin America, or other forces like China going into other parts of East Asia, the Japanese pre-World War II going into China and Korea, and colonizing those areas, and at the same time bringing their cultural traits into those areas. It's exemplified, for example, in Seoul, Incheon was created by the Japanese. War leaves a legacy of cultural interaction done by force. Using the occupying power leaves their mark on the cultural landscape. Migration. Through all forms of migration, whether it be international migration, interregional migration, or intraregional migration, there is a diffusion of cultural traits. This also includes diasporas, whether it be the transatlantic slave trade or other means. Trade. With the exchange of goods and services from one area to another, you typically have the exchange of cultural traits that become ingrained into that receiving society. Let's look at an example. One of my favorite foods is Jamaican jerk chicken. Now, food can be used as an example of creolization. Jerk chicken is a combination or a fusion of the cooking styles and the flavors of the Arawak Indians that are native to Jamaica and the Africans that were brought during the transatlantic slave trade. The dialect or the Creole language of patois, which you can find throughout much of the Caribbean, but specifically in Jamaica, is a fusion of English with West African languages fused together. So, for example, if I were to see this young man in, say, Kingston, Jamaica, I might say Wagwan Bridgin or Wagwan me brother, which essentially translate to what's going on, my brother, two different ways. So that is a great example of creolization. Colonialism. Inti Raymi is a great example of where colonialism mixed with Native American traditions. Inti Raymi celebrates, particularly in the summer months, celebrates the summer solstice. It is fused with celebrations of San Pablo y San Juan, or St. Paul and St. John. You have community members that form celebrations. There is a giving of food as a Thanksgiving to the community. There is a group of, as you can see in the middle, a group of musicians that circle around in the middle where the rest of the dancers in celebratory fashion will go around and chant, do various chants. On the left-hand side, it's in Cusco, Peru. And it's a little bit different celebration, but you do have the celebration of ancient Incan warriors, but at the same time, you also have the integration of Roman Catholicism in terms of religious celebrations in that regard. Salsa and salsa music and salsa dance is another great example of historical diffusion where you had, through the transatlantic slave trade, you had Africans that brought their drum beat, which is the lifeblood of salsa music, called the tumbao. Then couple that with the rhythms of the Spanish and the Arawak, and you mix that together. You fuse it, kind of like the sauce you have at a Mexican restaurant, where it's a sauce with it's a mixture of various spices and vegetables. Then take that and take Puerto Ricans and Cubans who migrated all over the world, but particularly I want to focus on New York. Because as Puerto Ricans came into New York, they started to interact with African Americans, and they took those Caribbean rhythms and they fused it together to create a what is called a New Yorican salsa genre. Probably one of my favorites to talk about, and I do a whole lesson in my class over this, and it's over K-pop. And I'm going to talk about the historical creation and diffusion of K-pop, and then Miss Patel, she's going to take that ball and she's going to talk about the contemporary diffusion of K-pop. So post-Korean War, a lot of American GIs, and even post-World War II, a lot of American GIs were listening to music from home. A lot of it was pop music, country music, you name it. And so there would be radio stations dedicated to those various genres, and they would be broadcast not just on the bases of American troops, but outside into the greater part of Japan. Post-Korean War, same effect, and a lot of the locals start to pick up the flavor of that. And then when J-pop took off, it kind of filtered and says, okay, we've got this new flavor. And then Korean pop took off, where basically it adapted American pop music, American pop styles, the fusion of these created images, if you will, and then the rest is history, as you know. Ms. Patel will talk more about this in her video coming up next. So let's practice. English is the most widely used language in the world, thus becoming the world's lingua franca. Define the term lingua franca. Identify and describe one historical factor that contributes to the worldwide use of English. Identify and explain two examples that show how globalization is contributing to English becoming the world's lingua franca. And this is an example of a free response question, one you've probably done in class, and that's okay. So, and maybe your teachers talked about this. The first thing I tell my students to do is treat this as a dead body. You've probably seen Law and Order or some of these detective shows. The first thing they do is, they have the episode where something bad happens, and then they cut the commercial, they come back, and what happens? Here come the detectives. What do we have? Oh, we have a blah, 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 and blah, 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 blah. And you have CSI. What are they doing? They're marking a crime scene. So the first thing you need to do is mark the crime scene on this FRQ, starting with the action verbs like define, identify and explain. And I know College Board is moving away from that, but I think this is a great practice in getting your mind together and thinking about how to write to these different topics that we're talking about in these videos. So again, lingua franca, as we talked about before, it is a global language. It is a language that is mutually understood by a group of people. So if I were to go to, say, Morocco, I would be able to speak French, and that would be pretty much almost mutually understood. If I were to go to, say, Belize in Central America and speak English, they would be able to understand me as I would be able to understand them. And so, looking at historical factors that contribute to the worldwide use of English, just for example, British colonialism, for example. Of course, we talked about wars, we talked about trade. Two examples that show how globalization is contributing to English becoming the world's lingua franca. It is the language of trade, it's the language of business, it is the language of the internet, pretty much. So much so that in many countries, English is the primary second language, if you will. And so what should we take away? Colonialism, wars, and trade have historically allowed for the transmission of cultural traits from one area to another. I'd like to give